Recently, I've read a number of books focused on the end of the world, some catastrophic event that ends our current way of life and gives birth to a new, often much worse version of society. So I thought, why not rank them? Hi, I'm Ben, welcome back to my channel. So this foray into post-apocalyptic or disaster fiction was mostly unintentional. These are books that I picked up on a whim or ones that I've just been meaning to read for a while, and it got me wondering whether it's a topic that I've subconsciously found myself drawn to, or if there's just more of it about and it's more in our faces. Well, I think it's a bit of both, because as readers and authors alike, we're living in a time of real existential discomfort. Like, obviously we're not the first to experience this. The Cold War era and the threat of nuclear annihilation was something that drove a lot of anxiety in the 1960s onwards, and on a related note, I think it drove some quite remarkable fiction as well. But in the 2020s, there's such a fertile ground of terrors, and it's coming at us from all angles. I find myself coming back to something I read recently in the book Delphi by Clare Pollard. I don't have the exact quote to hand, but right at the start of the book, there's this passage where the main character talks about how over the course of the vast majority of human history, people did not have to think about the long-term future. Things changed way more slowly, the horizon was a lot closer, not literally, like the figurative horizon of time. And people wouldn't have been able to quite see the arc of history as obviously as we can now. Looking back 20 years might seem much the same as looking forward 20 years. We as a species, though, now know so much and we have so much foresight, and that knowledge is so accessible that we can't ignore it, and it weighs us down. Climate change is the obvious example here. It's been in the public consciousness for some time now, and it's long been threat number one. But in the last few years, there's been an onslaught of new things to be afraid of. The COVID pandemic has made us awake to the threat of novel diseases in our hyper-globalized world. Nuclear-armed countries are weighing deeply troubling and horrifying wars that only seem to escalate and dehumanize. And just in the last year or so, AI's great leap forward has started to make us fear for our livelihoods and our ability to believe what we read and hear and see with our own senses. It's a time of huge anxiety, and so it's no wonder that authors are drawn to the impact of this stuff on people through fiction. Anecdotally, it certainly feels like a subject that's either being written about more or marketed more, and all of the books that I'm going to review today were written in the last 5 years. And so let us turn to these books. What I'm going to do is review each one of them from the one I liked least to the one I liked most, and then after I review each one, I'm going to give it a rating for how much I enjoyed the book, as I would on Goodreads or the Story Graph, but I'm also going to give it a rating out of 5 for how realistic it seemed to me as a viable depiction of how the world might end. All very cheery stuff. The good news is we get to start with a real stinker, which is Leave the World Behind by Rumaan. If we were to plot each of these books on a timeline between our current normal world and the distant future, this book takes place just before some cataclysmic event and a short while after. It's the story of a white family who rent out a holiday home in the countryside, and while they're away, something happens. The TV stops working, cell coverage breaks down, and so they don't really have sight of what's actually happening. And when the property's owners turn up wanting to stay, they're suspicious, not least because the owners of the property are an older black couple, and the white people's bias makes them inherently distrustful. I've been wanting to read this one for a while because despite a bit of a mixed reaction on Goodreads, the things that people seem to dislike in their reviews aren't really a problem for me. Like, I live for unlikable characters, and I'm not really bothered if a mystery isn't fully explained. I've watched Lost, I've watched The Leftovers, I'm cool with it. However, these characters aren't just unlikable, they are inexplicably unlikable. Their motivations make very little sense. There are multiple irritating sequences where a character just keeps on talking over another conversation, repeating themselves over and over again. I get that it's supposed to indicate bewilderment at the situation, but it just really infuriated me. As far as the mystery goes, although I don't need a big reveal, I do want to believe that the author knows what's going on. But in this book, I just don't. Alarm drops hints, but they feel like puzzle pieces from completely different jigsaws. Sometimes he makes it sound like it's a natural disaster, other times it seems like a bit of a war, but then he somehow implies that it's worse than a war. It might just be a me problem, but there didn't seem to be anything unified under the words on the page, and it leaves very little room for satisfying theories, which is half the fun of a book like this. The writing for me, I'm sad to say, was terrible. Multiple perspectives is something that I usually like, but the omniscient narration here was very awkward. It jumps without much clarity between moments and between characters' heads, but none of the voices are very distinct, and so it all felt quite wooden. There are loads and loads of just odd words shoehorned in, like odalisque. And while I suspect this was done to build a sense of unease and unfamiliarity, I couldn't help but picture a well-thumbed thesaurus sitting next to Alarm's laptop while he wrote. There's also this really weirdly sexual slant to many scenes that adds absolutely nothing. Like, there's one character lying on her front on a bed, and the narration calls out specifically that the bed is warming her vulva. And often these scenes were like quite close in the text to scenes involving the kids. I just found it really weird and not in a good way. It does create an atmosphere, I'll give it that, and there's some teeth stuff that will give you the shivers. But overall, this was a complete and utter failure for me. On to the ratings then. My personal rating was a 1 star. This was terrible. In terms of how realistic this was as an end-of-the-world scenario, I don't think what Alarm imagined being the cataclysm was realistic at all, but the lack of information was maybe a little bit more convincing. I do wish that one of the characters had at some point in the novel tried to turn on a radio, because it seems really obvious to me that radio would be the one technology that persists in a situation like this, but alas, they did not. I'll give this one 2 out of 5 for end of the world realism. But yeah, leave the world behind, more like leave this book behind. Next is The Doloriad by Missouri Williams, and oh man, I do not know where to start with this book. Well, let's start with the timeline. This takes place way after the breakdown of society has gone down. We join this group of survivors just outside a deserted city, which is not explicitly named, but I think it's Prague. The group is led by the matriarch, who is a woman that shuffles around on a mobility scooter, overseeing her efforts to forge this new society in line with her vision, and she wants to repopulate the world in her image. But like, very literally in her image, because everyone in the group is a single family. Except for her brother, every single person is either her child or her grandchild, which yes, means that they are all the descendants of incest, and many suffer from incest-related deformity or disability. The book is named for one of the children, Dolores, who is mostly non-verbal and missing her legs, and at the start of the book she is wheelbarrowed out into the forest to be left there because the matriarch has had a vision of another similar group, and she wants to marry Dolores off into this group to forge an alliance. How very medieval. But then, quite unexpectedly, Dolores finds her way back to the camp, and she throws the matriarch's leadership into question. This novel is depraved and grotesque. It's people at their absolute worst, and it's full of violence and sexual violence between family members. It's a book that does not empower its disabled characters at all, but it is mostly repulsed by them. It contains lots of very visceral bodily descriptions, lots of which are full of fat phobia and comparisons to pigs, and like, I know that's done on purpose, it's not trying to betray some underlying fat phobia by the author, I don't think, but it still is a little bit horrible to read. It's also absurd at times, with one character seeming to invent his own weird religion obsessed with moths, and the 13th century Italian philosopher Thomas Aquinas making regular appearances via an agony aunt TV show, and the line between the TV show and reality are frequently blurred. I'm sure there's some deeper meaning to that, but it kind of went over my head. I do think the attempts to unsettle are very successful, but maybe that's an easy win given the subject matter. And some of the group dynamics are really interesting. For instance, the children, like the grandchildren that are brought up completely in isolation from society, like they were born way after the world ended. They end up developing like their own language that can't be understood by the older members of the group. I thought that was really interesting. And it's another book that jumps between characters quite seamlessly, but here I think it was much more successful. It didn't feel like mechanical or rote, but felt much more artful, hopping between these quite intense streams of consciousness. But mostly, I've got to say, I found this one a slog, and I don't think it's a book that I had the patience or the intellect, or quite frankly, the stomach to properly appreciate. I rated this one 2 stars, and I think I'd also give it a 2 out of 5 for end of the world realism. Though to be fair, I don't really think this was an exercise in realism. My third favourite book of the 5 is The End We Start From by Megan Hunter. This was, I think, her debut novel, and part of the reason I read it is because there's been a film adaptation starring Jodie Comer that I would really like to watch. This book starts pretty much as a catastrophic climate event is taking place and London becomes flooded and uninhabitable. The protagonist has just given birth and she has to flee with her husband and his parents, and we follow her on a bit of a nomadic journey from place to place as she tries to find safety and stability. I really liked the style of this one. It's told in these quite short vignette-y passages, in a poetic style that's not too poetic for my taste. Things are hazy and deliberately so. We don't know exactly what's going on and how widespread it is, and we don't even know the characters' full names. Everyone is just referred to by an initial. That detachment might not work for everyone, but it did work for me. I feel like it allows you to properly project yourself into the main character's shoes, and you ask yourself, what would you do? How would you keep going? I also really liked the depiction of new motherhood in a crisis. I couldn't help but think and compare a little bit to Prophet Song by Paul Lynch, which depicts a similarly new mother in a very different crisis. The books are stylistically also super different, but I think in both there's something so compelling and urgent about them. What drags this one down a little bit is the other side of the coin from that sparse lyricism. It ends up feeling a little bit insubstantial. You could finish this in a day, probably in one sitting if you're that kind of person, and it made me long for a bit more meat on the bones because Hunter is clearly very talented. Referring to the characters by the initials will probably annoy some readers, but although it wasn't a problem for me, there were times it dragged me out of the story a little bit because I was thinking, oh, how convenient is it that everyone she meets has a name that starts with a different letter. I'm not hugely convinced by the necessity of the quotes that are included throughout. There's like a bunch of interjections that I assume are from different religious texts, and it often made me wonder, is there some other concurrent narrative going on, like some special book that's compiled that tells the story of this story, but it didn't really amount to anything. It was just there as like window dressing. Overall, I gave this one 3 stars, and for realism, I think it's a solid 4 out of 5. This could well be our future. Like, it's not a total collapse, but it's a huge displacement. It strains systems and infrastructure, and it leads to a world where we've got much less security. Kind of chilling in a way. Okay, in position number 2 is Jungle House by Julianne Pachico. This one's a little difficult to place on the chart because it's happening in a reasonably distant future, but the world-changing event seems much more protracted and drawn out, and it's kind of happening at the same time as some of the events of the novel, although like many other books here, it's not explicitly described. This is about a young woman named Lena who lives out in the holiday home of a wealthy couple, taking care of the maintenance of the home and acting as a companion for the couple's daughter during their visits. The house is out in the jungle. I kind of mentally imagined that it was the Amazon, but Pachico is, I think, Colombian, so it could well be there rather than Brazil. But yeah, it's set in the jungle, although the immediate vicinity of the house has been landscaped, and there are fences that carve out a big piece of the jungle as belonging to the family. A bit of cotton wool wilderness. While Lena is the only human who lives at the house, she isn't alone because she's accompanied by an artificial intelligence that she calls Mother. Mother isn't a robotic, purely functional utility AI. She's full of personality and comes across really human. At the start of the book, it's actually not explicitly called out, and you're shown rather than told that Mother is an AI, but it's kind of alluded to by some of the quotes on the back of the book, so I don't think that's too much of a spoiler. It's interesting that I think had I read this book a couple of years ago, I might have found Mother quite unconvincing, almost too advanced and too human, but the advancements of large language models like ChatGPT has made this kind of thing seem way more plausible. The beginning of the book is at a time when the family haven't visited the house for a while because something destabilizing has happened out in the world that's made it unsafe and their finances not quite as assured as they once were. The story also jumps between timelines, mostly through Lena recalling previous family visits. And the world around them is not the only thing in decay. Mother is experiencing these weird AI blackouts, or spells as she calls them, and it feels as though some shadowy rebels are closing in on the property. At the same time, there are some mysteries to unpick. Something is going on with the wealthy family, but what is it? And how did Lena even come to be at this house all by herself? I really enjoyed this one. The writing was pretty decent. The relationships between Lena and Mother and a few other characters were really enjoyable. And the class politics explored through this family owning some of the jungle was really interesting to read. I found the conclusion of the book and its mysteries really satisfying, actually. I gave this book 4 stars, but in terms of realism, I'm going to have to say 2 out of 5, partly because the end of the world narrative isn't really right at the forefront of the book, so it's hard to evaluate, but also because there were these couple of bonkers plot points in there that didn't harm my reading experience. I actually quite enjoyed them, but certainly did not feel very realistic. And actually, now that I think about it, this book would make a really fantastic episode of Black Mirror. I would recommend giving it a go. Okay, finally, my number 1 end of the world book here is Severance by Ling Ma. This is a book that has had a lot of praise and which I've been looking forward to reading for quite a long time, and I think it really delivered. It's set pretty equally between the time before the outbreak of this deadly fever called Shen fever, when our protagonist Candace is living in New York and finding her feet after college, and after, when the fever has devastated North America and she's part of this small band of survivors. The book actually was not quite what I expected. From the descriptions, I thought it might be a more satirical novel, like goofy in a Saunders-esque way, but it wasn't really that at all. There is a lot of millennial ennui, but it's actually played pretty straight otherwise. The before timeline is something that you might feel like you've read before. A woman in her 20s flits around New York, struggling to make ends meet and figure out what she wants to do with her life. She's capable, but she's disinterested. And the after timeline is, I think, a pretty convincing take on how things might go for a small group of people who are immune to a worldwide disease. This part is compared on the back to the TV show The Leftovers, and I can see that, but it reminds reminded me a little bit more of Station 11 by Emily St John Mandel, but I do think the execution here is far superior. We alternate between these two timelines, and we build up this picture of how the fever spreads and how the company that she works for tries to cling on to operating, paying Candace a huge sum of money to continue coming into the office. But it also shows how Candace's personal circumstances have a very real impact on her experience as a survivor afterwards. That intertwining of the two narratives and how they unfurl and speak to each other felt like it was really nicely done. What elevates the book, I think, though, is the quality of the writing, which feels very effortless. There's also something very accomplished in the way that across both timelines, there's a really interesting uniting theme of consumerism and capitalism, of those wealthy with money or power or spiritualism exploiting those without. Like, I loved how the band of survivors set across the country to find the facility which they were sold by the leader of their group, Bob. And he promises that it's like this utopia, this perfect place to settle. It has everything they need. And it turns out to be a bog standard shopping mall. And there are these bigger themes for nostalgia for better times, of capitalism having us on autopilot, both before Shen fever and then quite literally in its symptoms after it sweeps across the world. That the fever emerges from China is both eerily redolent of COVID, but also a bit of an echo of the West's capitalistic shame relying on cheap Chinese labour. It's something Candace has to battle with very intimately herself as well, because she is of Chinese heritage, but she works for a company that manufactures Bibles using Chinese factories. I didn't quite unpick the capitalism theme in full as I was reading, but I really loved the layers to it. Overall, I really enjoyed Severance and I gave it 4 stars. As far as a realistic depiction of the end of the world, I think it's a solid 5 out of 5. It's actually kind of scary to think that Ling Ma wrote this before the COVID pandemic, because there are so many beats that just rang true. And I have no doubt that even in the midst of a more serious disease like the one depicted in the book, capitalism would attempt to continue turning its greedy little cogs. A brilliant book, really enjoyed it. So have you read any of these books, or have you noticed more apocalyptic literature in your reading diet? If so, I'd love to hear from you down in the comments. And if you're taking part in the Read Good Challenge, you'll know that February is Feveruary and your prompt is to read a pandemic or post-apocalyptic book. If you've not yet ticked this one off, hopefully this video might give you some inspiration, and if you've not yet joined the challenge, then it's still not too late. You can find details in the description. That's all for this video, but until next time, toodles!